The United States has approved the sale to Ukraine of a package for the maintenance of air defense systems worth $180 million. The website of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency states that the supply list includes spare parts, repair equipment, consumables, and personnel training. In addition, the State Department has approved a possible sale to Ukraine of M109 self-propelled howitzers, maintenance and repair equipment, as well as related equipment worth about $150 million. And also, in another package, there will be Hawk air defense systems and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. It is not known who will pay for these packages, but the American side emphasizes in its statements that this sale aligns with the strategic interests of the United States. The U.S. State Department commented on the recent negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian delegations in Istanbul. President Donald Trump expects that the parties will continue direct negotiations, which will lead to a complete and unconditional ceasefire, as Ukraine insists. Public protests in Ukraine against the dismantling of the independence of the anti-corruption agencies NABU and SAPO are not being commented on at the government level in the United States. However, some members of Congress have made statements. And we'll be discussing all of this with TSN's own correspondent in the U.S., Olga Koshelenko. She is joining us live from Washington. Olga, hello. So let's go one by one. The State Department has commented on the third round in Istanbul. Do they really see progress in these negotiations, especially against the backdrop of ongoing Russian air attacks on us? Hello, Solya.
The deputy spokesperson of the State Department, when asked a similar question, was very reserved and basically read from the notes he already had a prepared text and didn't take the bait when they tried to get him to give a more detailed answer. His main point was that the United States welcomes direct dialogue, direct negotiations between the parties. And that's exactly what President Donald Trump wants. And, in his opinion, in the future this should lead to a complete ceasefire. As we can see, so far it hasn't. And that's something journalists here are pointing out. But at the state level, they basically aren't commenting. Let me remind you that Trump gave Russia another conditional deadline of 50 days for it, Russia to agree to a ceasefire. So when a question was raised about this to the deputy spokesperson for the Secretary of State, whether the Russians had already contacted Washington in any way about this, and whether they were holding any talks regarding this deadline, the deputy spokesperson basically said that he had no answer to that question. Let's listen.
We know that a third round of direct negotiations is taking place between the two sides. We continue to support ongoing calls for a complete and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine's ongoing calls for a complete and unconditional ceasefire, including a total halt to all strikes on civilian and critical infrastructure. And we welcome the news that Russia and Ukraine have agreed on a further exchange of prisoners, including those who are seriously ill and wounded.
However, when it comes to deadlines, President Trump has already had quite a few. He has more than once given a conditional 2 weeks or something like that for, as he says, something to happen. But there hasn't been such a long deadline, almost 2 months, before. Let me remind you that this deadline, his latest deadline for Russia, will expire at the beginning of September. Olga,
I also have to ask, why isn't the State Department or any other U.S. government institution responding to the protests in Ukraine, which are caused, among other things, by the rollback of the independence of anti-corruption institutions? What can you say about this?
Indeed, Olga, there haven't been any comments from government institutions on this matter. It's unclear why they're waiting or perhaps expecting this process to be completed and the laws to be repealed. Or maybe they're just too preoccupied with their own domestic agenda right now. But in fact, there haven't been any statements from government institutions so far. Although Ukrainian corruption, this topic, well, it basically always comes up whenever someone here wants to argue against helping Ukraine. They always bring up Ukrainian corruption. This topic comes up every time, and it remains relevant. Let me remind you that the creation of these anti-corruption bodies, NABU and SAPO, was at the time supported specifically by the United States. In other words, these are, among other things, their projects as well. But still, at the level of congressmen and senators, there was a certain reaction, and first of all, there was a statement from Congresswoman Jean Shaheen and Senator Lindsey Graham. These are very well-known supporters of Ukraine, politicians who are deeply interested in our domestic agenda. They have visited Ukraine more than once during the full-scale war and are well aware of our entire context. They released a statement, and I would say that the tone of their statement was rather restrained, but nevertheless, they stated that the law signed by Zelensky undermines the independence of anti-corruption bodies and called to refrain from this. And I suggest you listen to a quote from their statement right now.
We are concerned that the recent adoption of the law by the Verkhovna Rada, signed by President Zelensky, undermines a significant part of this progress and contradicts the tremendous fighting spirit of Ukraine, as well as the expectations of Ukrainian citizens and the international community. One of the most common arguments for ending support for Ukraine is that it has been riddled with corruption. We acknowledge that Ukraine continues to make progress in this area and urge the government to refrain from any actions that undermine this progress.
And another well-known figure, Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is known for her opposition to any aid to Ukraine, also didn't miss the chance to comment on these protest actions in Kyiv. And on her X page, she interpreted them as protests personally against Zelensky and called on Ukrainians, I quote, to throw Zelensky out of office. She portrayed it as if Ukrainians are protesting because Zelensky doesn't want to end the war and is resisting making peace agreements. Well, fortunately, even within the MAGA wing, this idea didn't catch on. So, Leah.
Thank you, Alia. TSN's special correspondent in the USA, Olga Koshelenko, was just with us live. She told us what was said about Ukraine this week, both about the third meeting between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations in Istanbul, and about the protests in Ukraine.
Svetlana Prestinska. The United States has approved the sale to Ukraine of a package for the maintenance of air defense systems worth $180 million. The website of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency states that the supply list includes spare parts, repair equipment, consumables, as well as personnel training. In addition, the State Department has approved a possible sale to Ukraine of M109 self-propelled howitzers and maintenance, repair, as well as related equipment worth about $150 million. Also, another package will include Hawk air defense systems and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. It is not known who will pay for these packages, but the American side emphasizes in its statements that this sale is in line with the strategic interests of the United States.